Before we get started with today's video, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody watching and anybody who's previously subscribed and is watching this video now. I ran into a lot of trouble shooting videos last year, mostly with the gear that I had, and so I've upgraded quite a bit of my gear and I'm back to start this year and continue making videos. Again, thank you so much for anyone who's been with me since the first video I posted last year. I know there hasn't been too much, but I'm planning on making many videos this year. So let's get started. Hello and welcome back to Kit's Kitchen. I'm not Kit, that's my cat, and this is her kitchen. Today we'll be revisiting my how-to sourdough bread recipe. It's only been a few months, but in that time I've learned a lot about bread making and how to be consistent with your breads. So I'm going to teach you the method that I use to make my breads. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to add is our starter. This is going to be 17% of 400, so 68 grams of starter. And you want to make sure that your starter is nice and active and very bubbly. Ideally, you'll have fed this the night before, leave it on the counter overnight, and it should be good to go in the morning, as long as your starter's been active for at least a week. So we'll add our starter here. That is 68, so we're good on our starter. Next, we'll go in with 8 grams of salt. And finally, we'll do 300 grams of water for 75% hydration. I'd also like to note there's a lot of different ways that I see people mix their ingredients. A lot of people like to do autolyse. I personally like to mix my salt, water, and starter together first. The reason for this is it's a lot easier for me to keep track of what ingredients I've added, and I find it easier to mix the starter together with the water instead of adding it to the flour later. So this is what I like to do, and it works for me. So we'll get that mixed in nice and thoroughly. And lastly, we'll come in with 400 grams of bread flour. I do recommend using bread flour. It has a lot higher protein content than all-purpose, which means we'll get a lot better gluten development, so you'll get a nice, good structure to your dough. If you don't have bread flour, you can do all-purpose. I would just lower the hydration to maybe 70% instead of 75% for the water. You can use whatever flour you have access to. I would aim for something around 12 to 13% protein. All right, so we'll add 400 grams of flour. And now we'll go ahead and mix that in nice and thoroughly. I am using a Danish dough whisk here. You don't have to use it. You can mix this all in with your hands, but if you have one, I definitely recommend using it. I would also not recommend a standard whisk, as your dough will get caught into a ball in the center and it's really difficult to remove, so either use a Danish dough whisk or just mix this up with your hands. Either way works fine. All right, and we're looking for something that comes together into a nice shaggy dough like this. This is the point at which you can go ahead and mix this in the rest of the way with your hands. And the way I like to do this is I'll just pull up a little bit and push it down into the middle, pull up from the side, down into the middle, and just kind of work this together until it comes together into a somewhat shaggy dough. And I like to scrape the sides of the bowl as I'm going as well. We're looking for something that looks kind of like this, and it's a little stretchy, but it will break. At this point, you can keep kneading until it's come together, but I like to let it rest for about 20 minutes. We'll come back and do a window pane test and either move on to the next step or let it rest again if it doesn't pass that test. So I'll see you in a little bit. Something I did forget to mention, when you leave this to rest for 20 minutes, cover it with something. I like to use a plate so that I'm not wasting plastic, but you can use whatever works best for you. It's now been 20 minutes. Now we're gonna do the window pane test. The way that this works is you're going to pinch a little bit of your dough and pull it up and see if you get any tearing. This is a really good way to test the gluten network in your dough to see if it's ready for pre-shaping and our next steps. So let's get started. I would recommend doing this with wet hands. Sometimes I'll grab a bowl filled up with a little bit of water so I can dip my hands in, but I just went ahead and got them a little bit wet in the sink. So now we can go ahead and try this. So you're going to just pull up a little bit of your dough there, and you can see it is holding its shape pretty well, but I did get a little bit of a hole. So what we're going to do is just go through the same process, pulling up, stretching, pushing down into the center of the dough, all the way around, and you should feel your dough start to get a little bit tighter as you're going. That's a good sign that there's gluten development. So we'll just go ahead and continue, maybe 2 passes all the way around. At this point, your dough should look something like that, pretty smooth, and it holds together a lot better than it did before. But we're going to let this sit for another 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and do the next step. It's now been another 20 minutes, so it's time for another window pane test. Just like before, we're going to grab a little bit of our dough and pull up, and this time it feels a lot stronger. I'm not seeing any major holes developing, so we can move on to the next step. Our next step is all about developing strength in our dough. This step is really important for getting a nice shape on your bread and making sure that it holds its shape and rises nice and tall. So what we're going to do is take your dough out of your bowl, and the first things I always like to do are just stretch the ends of the dough. So using a bench scraper or just your hands, pull the dough out and fold it up. And you'll do this on both sides, and then we can do a pre-shaped step. For this step, our goal is to roll our dough into a nice tight ball. The way that we're going to do this is by pushing and pulling our dough, either with your hands or a bench scraper. I like to use a bench scraper because it's going to get all of the bits of dough off the counter, but if you don't have one, you can use your hands. So what you want to do is push the dough at roughly a 45-degree angle and pull the dough back. When you pull your dough back, we're really going to be using our last 2 or maybe just our pinkies, and we're going to pull that dough in, and we'll do this a couple of times. Again, you can use your hand just fine, but I am going to use my bench scraper. And you'll do this just a few times until you get a nice tight dough that doesn't really stick when you touch it. It's also important not to rush this step. There's no need to go quickly, so definitely take your time and learn how this feels so that you're learning good habits and can learn to do this quicker in the future. Once your dough has come together, we're going to let it rest for 30 minutes. I like to do this in a bigger pot with a flat bottom. This way I can really keep an eye on how much my dough is spread out, and this will really help later in determining whether our dough is ready for our final shape. So this step here is called our pre-shape, and we're going to put it into our pot. We'll cover that up again with a plate, and we'll let this rest for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, we'll do our next step, which are called stretch and folds, and I'll show you what that looks like in 30 minutes. It's now been 30 minutes, and it's time to do our stretch and folds. This is a really important step in the bread making process, as this is our chance to develop as much strength in our bread as we can. So let me show you how to do it. Like before, this will be a lot easier if your hands are just a little bit wet. So you can grab your dough out of your pan. I'm going to do this step on the counter, but you can easily just do this in the pan if it's easier for you. So what we want to do is grab the center of the dough and lift up till we get this sort of U shape. And we'll let that just stretch as much as we can. And then we'll put it down and do it again from the other side. You may not get very much stretch, and that's okay. That means you've already got a lot of strength in your dough. So next we're going to do is reshape it into a nice ball. Just like that, and it goes back into the pot for another 30 minutes. So that's our first stretch and fold. If you want an easy way to keep track of how many stretch and folds you've done, I recommend just using a dry erase marker and taking a tally on your plate or your lid. This is a really simple way to keep track of how many stretch and folds you've done without needing any sort of counter or notes in your phone. It's all right here contained on your dough. And we're going to try and do 3 to 4 stretch and folds. So I'll see you in another 30 minutes. Alright, it's been another 30 minutes and it's time for our second stretch and fold. For this one, I'm going to show you a slightly different way to develop strength in your dough instead of doing a stretch and fold. This is called a lamination. Which one you choose really just depends on what your preference is, what works for you. Sometimes I'll start off with the dough lamination and then do 2 or 3 stretch and folds. But I just want to show you what this looks like in case you see the term lamination somewhere and you don't know what it means in the context of sourdough. So we'll take our dough out of the pot and we're going to just stretch this out as much as we can. The goal here is just to get a nice, big, even sheet of dough in roughly the shape of a rectangle. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this kind of stretching will really strengthen your dough a lot. So once you get that stretched out, we're going to take one edge and flip it over, and then we'll do another edge and flip it over, and then I just like to do another couple folds like that, and then we can roll this into another roughly shaped dough ball. At this point, your dough is going to be really tough, so you might not be able to get exactly a ball shape, but we'll let it rest for another 30 minutes and do another pre-shape. So it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. And there we go. Now we'll put it back in the pot. And just to reiterate, you could do the same stretch and fold as before. You don't have to do this. I just want to give you some options and show you what these terms mean in case you see them on the internet somewhere. We'll cover our pot back up, and we'll give it another tally, and now it sits for another 30 minutes. Time's up again, and it's time for our third and final stretch and fold. For this dough, I'm only going to do 3 because it's already been so tight, but if your dough is still feeling a little bit loose, you can do a 4th stretch and fold. So just like the first one, we're going to take our dough and just stretch it, and I'll do this on the counter so you can see. And we'll stretch it the other way and just kind of tuck that in a little bit. Because our dough is so tight, I didn't get much of a stretch and fold, but it's still good to do. So now we'll reshape it back into our ball shape, and it's nice and tight and smooth. And this will go back into our pan. And now that we're done with our stretch and folds, we're going to do a bulk rise. All that means is we're going to let our dough sit for anywhere from 5 to 9 hours, depending on how quickly it rises, and then we'll do our final shaping. Typically for me, especially in the wintertime, this is going to take closer to maybe 7 hours, maybe 8 hours, and once that time's up, I will be back and we'll do our final shaping. Welcome back! It is now the next day, and you may be wondering, I thought you said 5 to 9 hours, and I did. However, OBS decided that my last take was not worth saving and I had to restart. So we're back with another dough, and it's now been about 8 hours between the last stretch and fold and this final shape. So let's get started. For the final shaping, you're going to need a couple of things. I highly recommend using a banneton. This is going to be the best way to get a nice tall rise on your bread. You can use a sheet pan with your dough wedged between 2 boxes of cling wrap or parchment paper. However, you're just not going to get as good of a shape as you will with a basket, but if you don't have one, you can use that method. But I'll be using a banneton. For the banneton, we're going to use a little bit of rice flour. This is going to work to keep the dough from sticking to the wood. This is by far the best thing to use for this. You can use all-purpose flour, but I have had that stick before, so I would get some rice flour. It's really not too expensive. And lastly, if you have a little flour sifter, I would use this to just spread the flour evenly on your dough and on the counter. And now we can get started. First, I'm going to explain what we're going to do, and then I'll show you how to do it. we're going to turn our dough upside down onto the counter with a little bit of flour just to keep it from sticking. Then we're going to take the bottom of the dough and fold it up. Then we'll fold the sides in, and then we'll roll the whole dough up. So let's get a little bit of rice flour, and I'm going to put just a little bit on the top of my dough. This is just to keep it from sticking to the counter, and you can put a little bit on the counter too if you want. It won't hurt anything. And we're going to take and lift the edges of the dough up all the way around your pan. After that's done, you can turn your pan upside down and pull your dough out onto the counter, just like that. And it's okay if your dough gets a little bit stretched in this, because we're going to stretch it out a little bit anyway. Next, I would recommend, if you have a brush, it's going to be helpful here, but you can use your fingers or a paper towel if you don't have one. So we'll stretch our dough out into a little bit bigger disc than what we have. Being as gentle as you can, we don't want to degas our dough too much. So once you've done that, we're going to take the bottom of our dough and push it up about a third of the way up into the middle of the dough. Then we'll brush off any extra flour. We'll take our sides and we'll pull those in. Again, brush off any extra flour. We'll do the other side just like that. So now you should have what looks like a little bit of a burrito. And we'll brush off any extra flour that you might have. We're going to take the top and fold it down a little bit, and then we're going to just roll up the rest of the dough just like that. At this point, you can put it in your banneton, but we're going to tidy it up just a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is pinch all of these seams together so we get a nice even end to our bread. And we'll do the same thing over here. Pinch this together until it comes together nice and even. Brush off any extra flour if you have it. And then you can tuck in the corners and roll this up just like that. And then we'll put a little bit of rice flour on top and mix that in. You can't really go too much with this, so put as much as you want. And then finally, we'll turn this over and put it into our basket. The last thing we're going to do is cover this with a little bit of plastic and a kitchen towel. And now this will go in the fridge overnight. This step is called the bulk rise, and this is where our dough is going to grow into a bigger size and develop a little bit more flavor. Though most of your flavor was developed in the bulk fermentation, which was that 5 to 9 hour period between the last stretch and fold and the final shaping. You can leave your dough in the fridge for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, and then we'll bake it. So I'll see you tomorrow. Alright, it's now officially time to bake, so let me show you what you need. For sourdough, a lot of people like to bake in Dutch ovens or two-piece cookers. These are really good options if you have them, but they can be expensive, and it's very possible to bake without them. So let me show you what we can do. I'd also like to note that using this method I'm going to show you will allow you to bake multiple breads at once. So I think it's a little bit better, and it is a little bit more affordable. The first thing you're going to need is a sheet pan just big enough to hold your dough. I'm going to be using this big one, and I'll show you why here in just a minute. The next thing you're going to need is a way to generate steam in your oven. For me, I like this big metal pan. I can fill it up with water, put it in the oven, and I get a lot of steam. You can use any oven-safe container you have. A pot would work great, placed just under your sheet pan. Fill that up with water and put it in your oven. Once you put that in your oven, you can preheat your oven to 440 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius. While your oven preheats, put your dough in the freezer for 30 minutes and then we'll start the next step. Since I ended up with 2 doughs for this video, I decided not to bake the first one right away, and instead I thought this would be a good opportunity to test the difference between resting your dough for 24 hours and 48 hours. So we're going to bake both breads today, and we'll see what the differences are and if it's worth resting for 48 hours. Sometimes I see people who say they let their dough rest for up to 3 days, and to be honest, I've never really tested that, so this is a good chance to do that. And once my oven is done preheating, we'll start the next step, and I'll see you in just a little bit. The oven's been preheating for 30 minutes, so we can get started on the next step. Since I'm baking 2 breads, I will get 2 chances to show you how I like to prep them, so let's get started. For this, you're going to need something to score your bread with. I'm using a bread lame. If you don't have one, you can use a knife, but I would recommend getting one if you can, because these are just much better for scoring your breads. Next, if you have one, a water bottle to spray the tops of your bread will be very helpful. You can skip it if you want, but your crust will be affected by it, so I definitely recommend using one if you have it. Otherwise, you can try and wet the top of your dough however you see fit. And finally, I'm going to use this brush to brush off any extra rice flour that might be on my dough. I like to do this just so I get a nice brown crust. Our baking is going to be done in 3 stages. First, with steam. Next, without steam. And finally, without steam in the oven door cracked open. For the first step, we're going to bake for 20 minutes with steam in. Then we will do 15 minutes with no steam. And the last stage is going to be anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how dark you like your crust. It is important to work somewhat quickly after you score your breads. So what we're going to do is put the dough on our pan, spray them, score them, and put them in the oven. So let's do it. So this dough, I believe, is the one we made yesterday. So this will be 24 hours rested. This dough is the one we made 2 days ago. So this will be 48 hours rested. They both look very similar, so I don't think the 24 hours really made much of a difference in terms of how much the dough rose. So we will brush off all the extra flour. And I do recommend brushing the flour off of the parchment just to prevent it from burning. Next, we will spray the tops of our dough. And I like to spray mine quite a bit just to help with the texture of the crust. And the last step is scoring. A lot of people like to score their dough at a nice low angle to get a good big ear on their dough. I prefer to do a vertical slice down the center of the dough. This will give you a nice even oven spring, which will give you very uniform slices of bread. Right, there's 1 and 2. And then I always like to come in with just a couple more sprays of water. And now this goes in the oven. And remember, when you open the oven door, to be careful of the steam blast that'll come out. I always like to open the oven door a little bit, let the steam out, and then put my dough in. And those will bake for 20 minutes, and I will see you then for our next step. It's time for the stage 1 reveal, so let's see how we did. For this step, normally I would just pull the steam pan out, but I'm going to pull the dough pan out as well, just to show you what our breads are looking like. So this is what our doughs are looking like. You can see we've got a good bit of oven spring, but they're definitely not done yet, so they're going to go back in the oven. Remember to pull your steam pan out very carefully. The water is very hot and we don't want to splash it. I've never had any issues with water splashing on the oven door, but I have read stories of glass shattering, so try to be as careful as possible. That's going to make the cut. And then remember to remove the cap from the counter as well, and we'll move on to the next stage. For this stage, we're going to bake for 15 minutes with the oven door closed, and I'll see you then. Okay, we are down to the 3rd and final stage of baking, and this is by far the easiest step in the whole bread making process. All you need to do is crack the oven door open. I like to use a little wadded up ball of foil to keep the oven door cracked open for me. What this will do is allow any remaining steam to leave your oven, which will help set the crust of your bread. You can also rotate your pan if you like at this point. I usually will do that. I skipped it this time, but you can go ahead and do that if you want to. So we're going to let this go for another 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how long it takes for the crust to brown, and I'll see you then. Our breads have been in the oven for another 20 minutes and they are looking good, so let's pull them out. Initial impressions, they both look very good. They both had a really good oven spring. I think our shaping on this second one could have been a little bit better. I think I did a better job on this first one, but they both came out really good. So that's what our crust looks like on the 48-hour. And this is our 24-hour bread, the one that we did yesterday. We've got a nice even crust on both of them. And we've got some good blistering on the crust on this one. We've got a really good color development and our oven spring is very nice. And that is baking. At this point, I would recommend waiting until your bread cools completely before cutting into it. For any baked good that you make, they're not done baking until they are cooled. And if you cut into these right now, they're going to be really gummy and doughy. So it's best to wait until they cool down completely. I used to recommend waiting 24 hours, but I found that if you just wait until they're cooled down to room temperature, and I mean all the way cooled down, not a little bit warm still, they're just fine to cut into at that point. They won't be doughy or gummy. So I'm going to let these cool down before we cut into them. And in order to do that, I like to put mine on a wire rack. The air underneath the crust will allow them to cool a little bit quicker. So I'm going to leave them here until they're cooled down and then we'll cut into them. Our breads have now cooled to the touch, so we can cut them open. I'm going to start with the 24-hour rested bread and then we'll do the 48-hour and compare the crumb. Alrighty. So you can see we have a nice even crumb with a good shape all the way through. Our bubbles are nice and even. This is a really good bread. It's still nice and springy and a little bit moist inside. That's exactly what we want. And moving on to the 48-hour rest. You can see it looks very much the same as the last one. We have nice and even bubbling all the way through. Our bread is nice and springy. Based on both of the crumbs, I would say that there's not much difference between the 24 and the 48-hour. And with that, we're going to conclude today's video. If you have any thoughts or questions, drop them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.